When enemy armies destroyed the power grids, they believed the cities would stay dark for years. What they didn't expect was the U.S. Navy, turning warships into floating power plants, plugging electricity straight back into dead ports and ruined cities. This is the story of the moment ships stopped firing weapons and started powering the war instead. If you want to understand how wars are really won, not by firepower alone, but by the systems that keep armies moving, make sure to subscribe. These are the stories history rarely tells. When Allied forces liberated a city in World War II, victory did not arrive with cheering crowds or functioning streets. It arrived in silence. No lights, no moving cranes, no water pumps, no hospitals capable of operating beyond daylight hours. What the enemy left behind was not just rubble, but darkness. And in modern war, darkness was not symbolic. It was lethal. By 1943, both Germany and Japan had learned the same lesson. You did not need to defeat the Allied armies in open battle to slow them down. You only needed to destroy what kept those armies moving. Electrical power was the hidden backbone of mechanized warfare. Without it, ports froze. Fuel could not be pumped. Ammunition could not be unloaded. Water systems failed. Disease followed. A city without electricity was not merely damaged, it was paralyzed. As Axis forces retreated across Europe and the Pacific, they applied this lesson with methodical precision. Power stations were not sabotaged. They were dismantled. Turbine shafts were bent beyond repair. Generators were smashed. Transformers were blown apart. Switching yards were reduced to twisted metal. This was not destruction meant to delay the enemy for days. It was destruction designed to last years. From the German perspective, the logic was sound. Electrical infrastructure was massive, immobile, and slow to replace. Rebuilding a power plant required heavy turbines manufactured thousands of miles away. Concrete foundations poured on cleared ground, transmission networks restrung across ruined cities, and skilled technicians who might not even be available in a combat zone. Under ideal conditions, this process took years. Under wartime conditions, it could take a decade. The enemy assumed the Allies would face the same reality. Capture the port, but wait months before it functions. Liberate the city, but accept disease, congestion, and logistical bottlenecks. Victory would be delayed not by guns, but by kilowatts. And at first, that assumption appeared correct. In city after city, Allied engineers encountered the same scene. Harbor cranes stood silent, their motors useless without power. Warehouses filled with supplies that could not move. Hospitals operating under emergency lighting. Surgeons working against time and exhaustion. Water pumping stations offline, forcing civilians and soldiers alike to rely on contaminated sources. Every hour without electricity magnified the cost of liberation. Traditional reconstruction could not keep pace with the war. Engineers could repair roads quickly. Bridges could be rebuilt with prefabricated spans. Airfields could be scraped flat and operational in days. But electricity was different. Power plants were not something you patched. They were something you rebuilt from the ground up. This created a strategic problem that threatened to unravel Allied momentum. The war was moving faster than infrastructure could be restored. Each newly liberated city risked becoming a logistical dead end, a victory on paper that failed to translate into operational advantage. The enemy believed this was a permanent limitation. What they did not realize was that the United States Navy had begun to think about the problem from an entirely different angle. Instead of asking how to rebuild power plants faster, American engineers asked a more radical question. What if electricity did not need to be rebuilt at all? What if power could be brought with the fleet? The answer to that question would quietly transform ships from instruments of destruction into something far more unexpected. Not weapons, not transports, but something no enemy planner had prepared for. Mobile power. When Allied forces liberated a city in World War II, victory did not arrive with cheering crowds or functioning streets. It arrived in silence. No lights, no moving cranes, no water pumps. no hospitals capable of operating beyond daylight hours. What the enemy left behind was not just rubble, but darkness. And in modern war, darkness was not symbolic. It was lethal. By 1943, both Germany and Japan had learned the same lesson. You did not need to defeat the Allied armies in open battle to slow them down. You only needed to destroy what kept those armies moving. Electrical power was the hidden backbone of mechanized warfare. Without it, ports froze. Fuel could not be pumped. Ammunition could not be unloaded. Water systems failed. Disease followed. A city without electricity was not merely damaged, it was paralyzed. As Axis forces retreated across Europe and the Pacific, they applied this lesson with methodical precision. Power stations were not sabotaged. They were dismantled. Turbine shafts were bent beyond repair. Generators were smashed. Transformers were blown apart. Switching yards were reduced to twisted metal. This was not destruction meant to delay the enemy for days. It was destruction designed to last years. From the German perspective, the logic was sound. Electrical infrastructure was massive, immobile, and slow to replace. Rebuilding a power plant required heavy turbines manufactured thousands of miles away. Concrete foundations poured on cleared ground, transmission networks restrung across ruined cities, and skilled technicians who might not even be available in a combat zone. Under ideal conditions, this process took years. Under wartime conditions, it could take a decade. The enemy assumed the Allies would face the same reality. Capture the port, but wait months before it functions. Liberate the city, but accept disease, congestion, and logistical bottlenecks. Victory would be delayed not by guns, but by kilowatts. And at first, that assumption appeared correct. In city after city, Allied engineers encountered the same scene. Harbor cranes stood silent, their motors useless without power. Warehouses filled with supplies that could not move. Hospitals operating under emergency lighting. Surgeons working against time and exhaustion. Water pumping stations offline, forcing civilians and soldiers alike to rely on contaminated sources. Every hour without electricity magnified the cost of liberation. Traditional reconstruction could not keep pace with the war. Engineers could repair roads quickly. Bridges could be rebuilt with prefabricated spans. Airfields could be scraped flat and operational in days. But electricity was different. Power plants were not something you patched. They were something you rebuilt from the ground up. This created a strategic problem that threatened to unravel Allied momentum. The war was moving faster than infrastructure could be restored. Each newly liberated city risked becoming a logistical dead end, a victory on paper that failed to translate into operational advantage. The enemy believed this was a permanent limitation. What they did not realize was that the United States Navy had begun to think about the problem from an entirely different angle. Instead of asking how to rebuild power plants faster, American engineers asked a more radical question. What if electricity did not need to be rebuilt at all? What if power could be brought with the fleet? The answer to that question would quietly transform ships from instruments of destruction into something far more unexpected. Not weapons, not transports, but something no enemy planner had prepared for. Mobile power. The theory was elegant. The reality would be brutal. Turning ships into power plants was easy on paper. Doing it in a shattered port, under threat of mines, damaged piers, incompatible electrical standards, and constant operational pressure was something else entirely. Electricity does not forgive mistakes. A single mismatch in voltage, frequency, or phase could destroy equipment instantly. Failure would not simply slow the war. It could kill people. The first real tests came not in laboratories, but in the wreckage of recently liberated ports. Cities where the enemy had done everything possible to ensure recovery would be slow, painful, and visible from the air. Harbors choked with scuttled ships, power stations reduced to twisted steel, distribution networks cut apart with deliberate care. In these places, there was no margin for prolonged experimentation. If the concept failed, There was no backup plan waiting behind it. The process began with a simple act that felt almost absurd in its symbolism. A warship would enter a port not to fire, but to stop. She would tie up at a pier that often barely existed, surrounded by debris and unexploded ordnance. Instead of ammunition being offloaded, thick electrical cables were lowered onto the dock. Where torpedo tubes and gun mounts once dominated the deck, transformers and switchgear now appeared. From the shore, engineers watched as power that had once driven propellers began flowing inland instead. Synchronizing a ship's generators with a shattered civilian grid required patience and precision. Frequency had to be matched exactly. Voltage had to be stepped down or transformed. Phase rotation had to align perfectly. Teams worked hour by hour, testing connections, recalibrating equipment, and advancing cautiously. There was no dramatic switch flip, only the slow build-up toward a moment that could not be reversed. And then, quietly, it worked. Cranes that had stood frozen for weeks began to move. Pumps hummed back to life, forcing clean water through pipes that had been dry since the fighting. Hospital lights steadied, no longer dependent on emergency lanterns or unreliable diesel generators. Refrigeration units preserved food and medical supplies instead of letting them rot in the heat. The effect was immediate and disproportionate. One ship did not restore an entire city. It did something far more important. It broke the bottleneck. It turned a dead port into a functioning one. Supplies that had piled up uselessly began flowing inland. Vehicles could be fueled. Ammunition could be moved. The tempo of operations accelerated, not because more troops had arrived, but because electricity had. What the enemy had designed to take months was undone in days. Each successful deployment refined the method. Crews learned how to adapt shipboard power systems to different grids. Engineers standardized equipment. Procedures were written, then rewritten, then simplified. What began as improvisation hardened into doctrine. The enemy never saw this coming. From their perspective, the destruction had been total. Power plants were gone, grids were shattered, cities were dark. The assumption was that recovery would follow familiar timelines, long enough to matter strategically. Instead, they faced an opponent that had removed time from the equation. Ports came back online faster than intelligence estimates predicted. Cities resumed basic functions while battles still raged nearby. The destruction that was meant to delay the Allies instead revealed a weakness. Infrastructure that could be destroyed could also be replaced, if replacement did not require rebuilding at all. The war was entering a phase where electricity was no longer tied to geography. It sailed. Once the first ports returned to life, the implications became impossible to ignore. The enemy had assumed darkness was a weapon. Destroy the grid, and the city collapses. Break the power stations, and the army that depends on them slows to a crawl. It was a strategy built on the belief that infrastructure was static, fragile, and slow to replace. Floating power shattered that belief. Every successful deployment revealed the same pattern. The city did not need to be fully restored. It only needed enough electricity to function, enough to move cargo, enough to pump water, enough to keep hospitals alive. Total reconstruction could wait, war could not. This distinction changed everything. Instead of rebuilding cities before using them, the Allies began using cities while they were still being rebuilt. Ports that should have been liabilities became assets almost immediately. The front no longer had to pause and wait for engineers to finish their work. Engineers worked while the war continued to move forward. Darkness stopped being decisive. As the war expanded across continents, the problem repeated itself on a larger scale. In the Pacific, retreating forces destroyed electrical infrastructure with even greater thoroughness. Power stations were not damaged. They were erased, turbines smashed, boilers collapsed, transformers dismantled piece by piece to ensure they could not be salvaged. The assumption was the same. Rebuilding would take years. The Allies would be forced to slow down, divert resources, and accept delay. Instead, Power arrived by sea. Ships that had once escorted convoys or hunted submarines now sat at piers, their turbines running continuously, feeding electricity into cities that had been dark for weeks. In some cases, multiple ships worked together, synchronizing output to meet demand that no single vessel could handle alone. This was not an emergency measure anymore. It was a system. The ability to move electrical generation changed the nature of logistics. Electricity became something you deployed, not something you waited for. The front line could advance without worrying whether the infrastructure behind it would collapse under strain. Power followed operations instead of lagging behind them. For planners, this removed one of the last constraints of modern warfare. Supply lines could be extended deeper and faster. Ports that intelligence estimates had written off as unusable became critical hubs almost overnight. Timetables based on months of reconstruction became obsolete. The enemy was still destroying cities, but destruction no longer guaranteed delay. Each time a city went dark, it revealed the same mistake. The enemy had focused on breaking things. The Allies had focused on replacing functions, not permanently, just long enough to keep moving. Electricity did not have to be elegant. It did not have to be complete. It only had to be available. And availability, unlike buildings and grids, could be carried across oceans. By the time this reality became clear, it was too late to adapt. There was no countermeasure to a power plant that could arrive with a fleet and leave when it was no longer needed. There was nothing to bomb once the ship sailed, no fixed target to destroy. Darkness, once a strategic weapon, had lost its power. The war had reached a point where victory was no longer delayed by what the enemy could destroy, but defined by how quickly the Allies could restore what mattered most. And electricity mattered more than anything they had anticipated. Electricity did more than keep the war moving. It kept people alive. In cities where the fighting had ended but the damage remained total, the absence of power created a second, quieter catastrophe. Without electricity, water pumping stations could not operate. Without water pressure, fires spread unchecked and sanitation collapsed. Disease followed quickly: cholera, dysentery, typhoid. These were not battlefield losses, but they killed just as efficiently. Hospitals suffered first. Surgical teams worked by lantern light. Sterilization equipment failed. Blood plasma spoiled in the heat. Refrigeration units fell silent. What should have been survivable wounds became fatal simply because electricity was unavailable. Every hour without power translated directly into lives lost. When ship-to-shore power came online, the change was immediate. Water flowed again through damaged mains. Operating rooms stabilized. Refrigeration preserved medicine instead of destroying it. Mortality rates dropped not because better doctors arrived, but because electricity returned. The difference between chaos and control was measured in kilowatts. The humanitarian effect reinforced the strategic one. A city that could care for its wounded could support an army. A port that could pump fuel and unload cargo could sustain an advance. Electricity became the bridge between liberation and stability. Without it, victory remained fragile. With it, recovery began while the war was still being fought. This was the moment when floating power stopped being a clever workaround and became a doctrine. Planners no longer asked whether power infrastructure would survive an enemy retreat. They assumed it would not. Instead, they planned to replace it immediately. Power generation was folded into operational timelines alongside fuel, ammunition, and food. Electricity was no longer an afterthought. It was a requirement. What made the system so effective was its flexibility. A ship could provide power to a city for weeks or months, then leave when shore-based reconstruction caught up. If priorities shifted, the same ship could redeploy elsewhere. Nothing was wasted. Nothing was fixed in place. The solution moved at the speed of the war. This adaptability exposed the final flaw in the enemy's strategy. Destruction assumes permanence. It assumes that breaking something creates a lasting absence. Floating power proved the opposite. Functions could be restored without rebuilding structures. Systems could be replaced without recreating them. The enemy had destroyed buildings. The Allies replaced outcomes. By the time enemy planners understood this distinction, it could not be undone. Every demolished power station simply created another opportunity for mobile generation to step in. Every dark city became a temporary problem instead of a strategic one. The war had reached a point where electricity was no longer tied to land. It belonged to whoever could move it. The floating power solution did not emerge from a master plan to change warfare. That was precisely why it worked. The enemy planned for reconstruction to be slow because history told them it always was. Power plants were massive, complex, and immobile. Destroying them had always meant delay. That assumption had held true for generations of conflict. World War II was the first time it stopped being true. What the Allies discovered was not a new weapon, but a new kind of advantage. Electrical power had always been treated as infrastructure, something you owned, defended, repaired, and rebuilt. The moment it became mobile, it stopped behaving like infrastructure and started behaving like logistics. And logistics, unlike buildings, could be repositioned, redeployed, and prioritized dynamically. This shift changed how war could be sustained. If a port lost power, it no longer meant the campaign stalled. It meant a ship would be reassigned. If a city's grid was annihilated, it no longer meant years of darkness. It meant days of improvisation. Strategic timelines collapsed inward. What once required long pauses now required only coordination. For the enemy, this created an unsolvable problem. There was no longer a fixed target to destroy. Bombing power stations became symbolic rather than decisive. Even perfect demolition only created a temporary inconvenience. The moment power arrived by sea, the effect of destruction evaporated. Countering floating power would have required a fundamentally different approach. You could not mine every harbor indefinitely. You could not hunt every ship capable of generating electricity. And you could not predict where power would be needed next. Mobility removed predictability, and unpredictability removed leverage. The advantage compounded itself. Each successful deployment trained crews, refined procedures, and simplified integration. What began as an improvisation matured into a repeatable capability. The more it was used, the faster it became. The faster it became, the less effective enemy demolition grew. This asymmetry mattered more than firepower. The Axis powers continued to fight bravely and skillfully with the tools they had. But they were trapped inside a framework where destruction was assumed to be permanent. The Allies had stepped outside that framework entirely. They had learned how to replace function instead of rebuilding form. Electricity was only the most visible example. The deeper lesson was that the war was no longer decided solely by who could destroy faster. It was decided by who could adapt faster, who could move solutions instead of waiting for conditions to improve. By turning ships into power plants, the United States Navy had not just solved a logistical problem. It had exposed a vulnerability in the very idea of static warfare. When the lights came back on, the change was visible almost immediately. It was not dramatic in the way explosions were dramatic. There was no single moment that defined victory. Instead, there were small, unmistakable signs that order was returning. Streetlights glowing in neighborhoods that had been dark for weeks. Hospital wards operating through the night. Water flowing steadily instead of intermittently. Cargo moving again through ports that intelligence reports had written off as unusable. For civilians, electricity meant survival. For soldiers, it meant continuity. Operations no longer stalled at the edge of destroyed cities. Supply chains extended forward without pause. Units could advance knowing that the infrastructure behind them would not collapse under the strain. The war did not slow down to accommodate reconstruction. Reconstruction adapted to the speed of the war. This had consequences far beyond any single city. As Allied forces moved faster, enemy planning fell further behind. Timetables based on prolonged disruption no longer matched reality. Every assumption about delay had to be rewritten, often too late to matter. The gap between expectation and outcome widened with each restored port and reactivated grid. The floating power program did not eliminate destruction. Cities were still devastated. Lives were still lost. But it stripped destruction of its strategic payoff. Breaking infrastructure no longer guaranteed time. And time, more than territory, was the resource the Axis powers could not afford to lose. What emerged was a pattern that would shape conflicts long after World War II ended. When disaster struck, power arrived first. Not as a permanent solution, but as a bridge, a way to stabilize, sustain, and recover while longer-term rebuilding took place. The same logic that had kept ports running under fire would later keep cities alive during peacetime emergencies. The idea proved portable across eras, continents, and circumstances. The war revealed something uncomfortable but undeniable. Victory did not belong solely to those who could destroy cities. It belonged to those who could restore essential functions faster than destruction could outpace them. Electricity became the clearest symbol of that truth. It did not win battles, but without it, battles could not be won. The floating power program did not win World War II by itself. No single system ever does. Tanks broke through front lines. Aircraft dominated the skies. Soldiers took ground inch by inch at enormous cost. But none of those victories could hold without something quieter and far less visible. Electricity. The Axis powers believed they understood modern war. They mastered the art of destruction. They learned how to collapse bridges, crater ports, and dismantle power stations so thoroughly that rebuilding seemed impossible. Their strategy assumed permanence. If something was destroyed completely enough, it would remain absent long enough to matter. That assumption was wrong. The United States did not defeat this strategy by repairing infrastructure faster. It defeated it by abandoning the idea that infrastructure had to stay in one place at all. Power plants did not need buildings. They needed turbines, generators, fuel, and trained crews. Everything else was optional. By putting power on ships, American engineers erased the enemy's timeline. Cities that were supposed to remain dark for years regained essential functions in days. Ports that should have slowed the war instead accelerated it. Humanitarian collapse was avoided not through reconstruction, but through substitution. The war moved on while the ruins were still smoking. This was not a technological miracle. It was a philosophical one. The Axis powers fought a war built around fixed assets and permanent damage. The United States fought a war built around mobility, redundancy, and adaptability. One side tried to break systems. The other replaced outcomes. When the enemy destroyed power stations, they believed they had created an irreversible problem. When American ships arrived carrying electricity, that belief collapsed. In the end, this difference defined the war more clearly than any single battle. You cannot win a modern war by destroying faster than your enemy can adapt. You cannot paralyze an opponent who has learned how to move solutions instead of defending locations. And you cannot defeat a nation that understands how to turn even its warships into instruments of recovery. When cities went dark, the Axis powers believed the lights would stay off. They didn't. Because while the enemy mastered the art of breaking things, America mastered something far more dangerous: the ability to build anything, anywhere, and move it across oceans. Even electricity itself. If this story changed the way you see World War II, hit like and subscribe. Because the most important victories aren't always fought with weapons.